Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Congressman Zach Nunn, a Republican from Iowa, about the legacy of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan, the coordinated cyber attack on our elections here in the U.S., and where the Republican Party stands on artificial intelligence regulation. And then we break down the most heated foreign policy moments from this week's presidential debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. An exciting episode coming up as we have Congressman Zach Nunn here to talk about Afghanistan, AI, cybersecurity, and a whole lot more. We'll also hear a little bit more about America's offensive cyber operations, which is a really fascinating subject, and one we tried to tackle last week at the Billington Cybersecurity Conference as well. So lots of good stuff coming up on all of that. But before we get to the interview, as always, Guy, first things first, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here as always. A few things to note. The past few days marked a disturbing statistic in the civil war raging in the northeast African nation of Sudan that gets not so much attention in the world's media, given everything else that's going on. But there are now more than 20,000 people have died in that civil war, according to the United Nations. And there's a mass famine developing, according to aid officials. I have a Threat Status Influencers video interview coming out soon at the Washington Times with Susan Stigant, the director of Africa programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She tells me that the casualty count and the famine developments are likely worse than what's reported in the global media, and that the situation could devolve into really one of the worst famines in human history, affecting millions of people. Mostly women and children. Shifting gears, Ben, recent days saw China's defense ministry announce new joint naval and air drills with Russia that will start this month. This is the latest sign of deepening military cooperation between the two U.S. adversaries. Some of the exercises will take place in the Sea of Japan, according to Chinese officials. We'll be tracking that in the daily Threat Status newsletter. Interestingly, China's announcement came around the same time that high-level military-to-military talks between U.S. and Chinese officials resumed in recent days after being halted for more than 2 years amid heightened diplomatic tensions between Washington and Beijing. The Pentagon says Admiral Sam Paparo, the commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, held a video conference with Chinese General Wu Yanan, who heads China's regional forces. During that call, Admiral Paparo called on Beijing to, quote, reconsider its use of dangerous, coercive, and potentially escalatory tactics in the South China Sea and beyond, end quote. That's according to a Pentagon statement on that meeting. Beijing has made expansive sovereignty claims in the South China Sea that are rejected by the U.S. and smaller countries around the region, including U.S. treaty ally, the Philippines. This restoration of direct U.S.-China military talks could help diffuse tensions or stave off an accidental U.S.-China military clash. It's notable that after the Paparo-Yanan video conference, the Chinese Defense Ministry issued a one-paragraph statement saying only that the two officers, quote, exchanged in-depth views on issues of common concern, end quote. Finally, Ben, an eye-opening development on Capitol Hill in Washington in recent days saw the sheriff of Tulare County in California testify at a hearing of the House Judiciary Committee about a network of assassins associated with Mexican cartels operating inside the United States. Sheriff Mike Bordeaux told federal lawmakers that his department recently dismantled a Sinaloa cartel operation in his area, including the arrest of self-admitted cartel hitman who claimed more than 25 kills in the state of California. This is really unsettling. information, Ben. The sheriff testified that in the course of his investigation, which targeted some 50 cartel associates, he was told by suspects that smuggling people, drugs, and guns across the border is, quote, easier now than in the history of their cartel, end quote.
Yeah, that's sobering, to say the least. And obviously, we're going to keep tracking that here at the Threat Status Podcast. Guy, I want to turn to this week's presidential debate between Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Kamala Harris. And this, of course, was a very different debate than the one we saw a couple months ago between Trump and President Joe Biden, who ended up being pushed out of the race by his own party, largely because of his performance in that debate. Harris, of course, looked younger, was more forceful, certainly more clear in making her argument about why she thinks she should be the next commander in chief. Now, we, of course, focus primarily here on foreign policy and national security, and there was no shortage of that at the debate. Donald Trump was pressed on how he would try to end the Ukraine-Russia war, and he was asked specifically a couple of times whether he wanted to see Ukraine win, and he just kept coming back to his, refrain about wanting to end the war as soon as possible. So it's clear where he is coming down on that point. But a few other things really caught my eye here, including a back and forth about Afghanistan. We'll dive into Afghanistan a little bit more deeply with Congressman Zach Nunn later in the show. But when pressed about the Biden administration's handling of the August 2021 U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, Vice President Harris turned the focus back to Trump. And the Trump administration, of course, negotiated with the Taliban and signed an agreement in 2020 that paved the way for the U.S. withdrawal a year and a half later. Harris absolutely lambasted that deal. And here's a little bit of what she said about it.
But let's understand how we got to where we are. Donald Trump, when he was president, negotiated one of the weakest deals you can imagine. He calls himself a deal maker. Even his national security advisor said it was a weak, terrible deal. And here's how it went down. He bypassed the Afghan government. He negotiated directly with a terrorist organization called the Taliban. The negotiation involved the Taliban getting 5,000 Taliban terrorists released. And get this. And the president at the time invited the Taliban to Camp David.
Now, that's a good argument. I mean, politically, it's smart. It's really hard to defend that deal in retrospect, even though there was and still is a lot of bipartisan agreement that it was time for the U.S. to get out of Afghanistan. But here's what was missing in her answer, Guy. The agreement wasn't binding in any way. It was never voted on in Congress. It wasn't ratified by the Senate. There was nothing sticking the Biden administration to it. As a matter of fact, Trump, I think, very wisely pointed out that fact, that by the time the Biden administration came to power in early 2021, it was already pretty clear the Taliban were not living up to the deal. And Trump made that explicit point during the debate as well.
We did have an agreement negotiated by Mike Pompeo. It was a very good agreement. The reason it was good, we were getting out. We would have been out faster than that, but we wouldn't have lost the soldiers. We wouldn't have left many Americans behind, and we wouldn't have left $85 billion worth of brand new, beautiful military equipment behind. And just to finish, they blew it. The agreement said you have to do this, and they didn't do it.
And it was obvious then, and it's far more obvious now, that al-Qaeda does in fact have safe haven in Afghanistan. Friend of the show, Bill Roggio of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, had a great analysis recently about how al-Qaeda has set up training camps now in 12 Afghan provinces. So Biden and Harris could have pulled the plug on this deal at any time. I've never understood the argument that the administration has been making that Trump tied their hands somehow with this deal, even though it was clearly predicated on promises the Taliban had already broken before the withdrawal process even began in the spring and early summer of 2021. I'm glad this issue came up at the debate. I honestly thought that it might not, because it seemed like mutually assured destruction for both candidates, because they both deserve blame for this. So I thought maybe they try to avoid it altogether, and when they're asked about it, pivot to something else. But to their credit, they didn't. And I think that's good for our country. It's good for our democracy to have this debate and talk about Afghanistan openly and honestly at a presidential debate. But politically, Guy, I don't think that either candidate really scored a lot of points on this one. And we We are joined now by Representative Zach Nunn. He is an Iowa Republican and a former airborne intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force. You're still in the Air Force Reserve, Congressman, and you were the director of cybersecurity at the White House National Security Council. You've been in Congress since 2023 and are now running for re-election to your second term. So with all of that, thank you so much for joining us here. It's a pleasure to have you in the show.
Ben, Guy, hey, first of all, very thrilled to be on here. I think it's important to have conversations like this. It's also very important to hear from your listeners and the conversations that you're sparking here. This is how we not only get smarter, I think this is part of the parlay that's absolutely essential for us to come up with good policy going forward, recognize failed policy and try and make corrective changes, but then also talk about some of the really big, hard challenges when it comes to U.S. national security.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you for that. And I want to start, of course, we're recording this on Wednesday, September 11th. So it seems appropriate to maybe start there. We had a long-awaited report this week from Representative Michael McCaul, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan all the way back. Feels like so long ago, but it was 3 years ago in August of 2021. Look, this is obviously a major political issue. We saw it come up, I think, a little more than I expected, quite frankly, at last night's debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And let's be honest here. I think some on the Republican side believe you can maybe score political points by hitting President Biden and Kamala Harris for how the withdrawal played out. And maybe that's true. But what specifically do you think could have and should have been done differently? Are we talking about leaving troops in Afghanistan? Did we give up Bagram Air Base too early? Should we start evacuating people in the spring instead of waiting until the summer? You know, if the mission was to get out, which both Donald Trump and Joe Biden, agreed on that overarching goal, where specifically do you think this administration went wrong along the way?
Well, look, let's not gloss over the fact that we were in Afghanistan because of something that happened on 9/11/2001. We all remember where we were. We are serving today because of those events. It compelled me to go join the military, and I know many of my brothers and sisters did the same. We are now 2 decades into that event with a loss of over 7,000 Americans, including the 3,000 or excluding the 3,000 that also died on 9/11. And then we have a number of, challenges that have been wrought by those 2 conflicts that are impacting us right here at home. As a military guy and a former commander, we've got 30,000 death by suicide events related to people who served in these conflicts. So the impact is real, and the planning for this has to be thoughtful, but also do justice to those who served. And here is where I have been very proud to work with McCaul and the team in Congress to do a 3-year-long review on this to identify what things could be changed, what things went wrong, and what things we should learn from so that situations like this don't happen again. So let's just start with the bottom line up front. The reality here is this report came out and it was very clear that the conclusion of the report said each step of the way that the Biden administration moved out of Afghanistan picked optics over security. And we heard from guys who were on the line, watching the withdrawal, the overrun of Kabul, the failure to get Americans out, the failure to get allies that we promised, the same guys who were my interpreters on the ground that saved U.S. combat forces, many of them doing multiple, if not up to, double-digit combat tours out there, who were just forgotten about. And this doesn't just happen. This is a decision that was made at the highest levels. And as a result, we turned our back on people who had spent a lifetime serving us and who afterwards lost their life as a result of our failure to plan. There are security concerns that we still have in the entire region. Abandoning one of the best overland base operations for long-term dwell when it comes to drones, when it comes to just-in-time strikes, and when it comes to countering near-peer adversaries, both in Russia, but particularly in China and Iran, we abandoned that post. The Trump administration called for leaving about 2,500 troops behind in country. And when we talk about any U.S. president, whether it's Republican or Democrat, our number one priority has to be the safe evacuation of American troops. Leave the material aside, leave the strategic environment aside, but we lost 13 American military members with the explosion at Abbey Gate because we failed to plan. Just yesterday, I spent time with those Gold Star families, and I heard from them, including the parents of Corporal Deacon Page, a gentleman who served in the U.S. Marines. He was from my district. He's right in Red Oak. He's an Iowa kid who grew up, and he went to go serve his country. And his entire job was to help safeguard those who were allies of us. And he lost his life because of an attack by ISIS, but challengingly, an attack that was identified, alerted, warned by intelligence, but we were not able to prevent because we chose the immediate evacuation. And I still recall President Biden saying this is not going to be another Vietnam. There are not going to be helicopters lifted off of U.S. embassies. But the reality was we saw Chinooks taking out the president of Afghanistan while American citizens left behind. We saw Afghan allies cling to the tires of C-17s as they left the tarmac at Kabul Air Base and died as a result. And I will say my proudest moment as a military member wasn't when I was serving in uniform. It was being part of this corps of veterans and volunteers who in the days after the fall of Afghanistan led the charge in their own time on Signal and WhatsApp to evacuate folks. And we personally led a team called Task Force Argo. We evacuated over 3,000 Americans and their allies through Mazar Sharif, an airport, about an 18-hour drive to the north. And we shuttled them up to get on airplanes that flew them out of country with no help from this administration. And worse, when we reached out to the State Department and the Department of Defense asking for overflight permissions to evacuate Americans, they constantly turned their back on us, and we would have lost even more had it not been for the, this Dunkirk-like task force of Americans who stood up in the middle of the night to help evacuate these folks and bring them back home to safety.
Congressman Nunn, it's Guy. Thank you for coming on, and thank you for your service, both as an American veteran and now in the federal legislature. This House GOP Afghanistan report is really eye-opening. The stuff about a burning pile of passports, the whole handling of failing to get Afghans out who helped Americans in fighting the Taliban is just sobering. Also, it's actually a well-written report, so I encourage people to find it online and read it. But my question is maybe big picture political here. What about former President Trump's role? Was former President Trump wrong to pursue and then negotiate a deal with the Taliban for U.S. troops to leave Afghanistan to begin with? I certainly understand blaming Biden here. We want to be responsible and truthful about the backstory. And I think a key piece of it is that Trump, a Republican president and the party's now current nominee, and maybe president again, his administration sat down with the Taliban and struck a deal for the U.S. to leave. Did you support that? How do you see it in retrospect? And was it a good idea?
Yeah, Guy, it's a fair question, and one I think it's really important to look at in the entire context of this. Look, as somebody who deployed on combat sorties over Afghanistan on multiple deployments, this wasn't just Biden or Trump. This went all the way back to the Obama and the Bush years as well. So we had 20 years of American blood, sweat, and treasure poured into this. And at any point, we needed to identify what was the long-term interest to U.S. national security. I truly believe there was value in going after Osama bin Laden and of making sure that Afghanistan did not become a failed state. While we were there, we did some really important and good things too. Two of the young women that we rescued get to be American citizens today and not Taliban child brides because of the work the U.S. did in leadership in that part of the world, and probably prevent a lot worse situations happening. But when Trump was president, he focused on what was the end state here, something I would offer the Biden administration never had a plan for. The Doha Agreement was to be able to say we can keep most of the Taliban's extremism at bay with a small, tactically responsive force. And more strategically, we could counter China's influence, certainly Iran's influence, and even Russia and Pakistan's negative influence in the region by providing a stabilizing force. I think that makes a lot of sense. You'll see the repetition of this in places all over the world, from Syria to, Eastern Africa, as a way to just being an immediate response so that we're not sending carrier strike groups into the, Indian Ocean. They're getting pot shots by Houthi rebels today. The debaucherous withdrawal not only cost 13 American service members their life, it lessened America's standing in the world. And this is where I think it's important to note a difference of approach here. The president's plan under President Trump was not just a full-scale rout and evacuation a la the Soviets in 1979 out of Afghanistan, which then precipitated the fall of their country. It was also about what we could do in the plans, a timeline for procedures, a process to carry out a goal that was achievable. We didn't see any of that, at least from my perspective, and certainly from a number of the commanders on the ground who testified in front of the committee from the Biden administration. In many cases, we saw them prioritize the evacuation even over the safety of our own troops. And here's where I think the real damage comes into play. Now we have a situation that's not just Afghanistan related. We've seen emboldened Iran. We've seen emboldened Russia. We've certainly seen emboldened China. They saw the failure there. And the people who are now operating Bagram Air Force Base, the very place that we rebuilt from the Soviets, are now the Chinese.
Congressman, the 2024 election and the politics surrounding it in some ways are kind of colliding with these big picture issues, one of which being artificial intelligence and what our country's going to do with that moving forward, a life-changing technology, literally. The party platform, a GOP party platform, calls for repealing President Biden's executive order on artificial intelligence and embracing, quote, AI development rooted in free speech and human flourishing, unquote. Now, this, of course, as you well know, comes at a time when there's very real fear about AI possibly becoming sentient at some point in the next 2 years, about, Q Day that we've talked about on the show, when AI and quantum computing come together to break all the encryption we have, and other very serious risks about this. So, I think we need some rules, don't we? So what should they be? I mean, is the Republican Party's platform dangerous if it's trying to roll back regulation on this front? Where do you come down on that question?
Yeah, so I'm very much involved in this. Look, Director of Cybersecurity, I worked counterintelligence for more than a decade, focusing on China and Russia, how they have been using this. We're really ceding a lot of this battle space to nefarious actors. And the reaction under the Biden administration, in my opinion, has been to put handcuffs on innovators stateside while allowing folks across the seas to really take some of the worst possible forms and applications of what artificial intelligence could bring to the fight. Now, what we've done, I serve on the Artificial Intelligence Task Force here in Congress, and we have pushed forward personally a piece of legislation called the AI Plan Act, which says before the government starts telling private innovators how to do business, we need to get our own house in order. We have multiple agencies, not through Congress, but through the regulatory state, jumping out there because AI is the buzzword and putting a ton of restrictions, red tape, bureaucratic involvement, oversight, fines and fees on top of innovators. And this is really creating a chilling effect. We're already seeing it. As a result, it's pushing some of our best innovators, the future of AI, to look at operating either in the shadows or worse, to go overseas. And that puts us in a position where we have very limited capability. So first and foremost, the federal government's got to get its role in order. Second, I think there's a great pathway here that we have learned from a bipartisan perspective on cybersecurity. Look, we should be providing the guardrails for this, but the federal government can't do this alone. We need to have a good public-private partnership on this, just like we did with cybersecurity, to create hardened security for American citizens while still allowing innovation to be able to flourish in this space. I think there's a great opportunity here where government can provide the lane and we can allow our private sector to provide the speed to really drive this forward. It will be not just the next battlefield, it will be the next economic revolution coming out of somebody in the world. And I hope the United States gets to be a leader in this, and that we're not the ones who put handcuffs on ourselves or our innovators and allow somebody else to take pole position.
Congressman, I want to shift gears a little bit on the tech front. There tends on the right in the U.S. political landscape to be this kind of knee-jerk reaction to the narrative of Russian meddling attempts, and especially in the wake of the 2016 media hysteria and sort of Russia Gate, as if Russia is not meddling. But if we jump ahead to today and we're in this kind of advanced cyber state, you served as director of cybersecurity at the White House, so you're probably in a pretty unique position to give us some context here on the current wave of cyber threats facing the U.S. and the election system. From where you sit, how serious are the threats from Iran, Russia, China, and other actors? And are they working together? We've had discussions here about how it's almost as if Iran is being fingered or named as the point actor, with Russia and China in the background doing global propaganda pushes with anti-American sentiment. What are your thoughts on this, and what can you tell us?
Yeah, I'll just say straight out the gate, it continues to be one, if not the top national security concern here in cyberspace, just because of the ripple-on effect of the equivalent of a cyber A-bomb going off and how many other aspects it will have a downstream impact on Americans' everyday way of life, not to mention our national security writ large. We have seen Russia for a long time not only be the leader in this, but they have moved aggressively to transition from this kind of pseudo cyber army to now mobilizing entire special operations forces, their version of JSOC with a cyber embed to specifically target for maximum damage. We're seeing this in real time here in the United States. I think Tennessee was a perfect example just this past week of where you've got real people trying to cover as influencers, bringing in Russian style tactics, techniques, and procedures and trying to either buy American influencers or insert themselves into the space in a really intentional way in a lead up to a US national election. And it's not lost on our adversaries. We have always known the Iranians model off of what they see happen, particularly by Russia, without very much pushback by the United States in this area. And they're certainly replicating this very effectively in their IRGC activity in the Middle East. Certainly, that's carried over here to the United States. I think the real challenge here, though, is we've seen a dramatic evolution in where the Russian botnet experience to the attempts of, crypto ransomware to now we are seeing what I think is incredibly scary, information manipulation and even next-gen data manipulation that really returns something that we think should be absolutely critical for us to make our informed decisions now being eroded. And that means the decision maker has less access to good information, but it also means everyday Americans are potential victims here, not just to the misinformation, but real data corrosion that, not only seeds our bank accounts and our national security issues or our precision guided munitions. Now we have to call into question what is by far going to be the most valuable resource going into the next generation of AI is, do you have the data and can you trust the data? And this is clearly a target set that all three of these countries, and I would throw North Korea in here as being really savvy actors in trying to do targeted data manipulation to throw the West off.
Congressman, I want to squeeze one more in here before we run out of time. Given your background and your unique perch sort of on these issues, are you satisfied with what you're seeing as a member of Congress, with what you're seeing in terms of what America is doing right now from an offensive cyber perspective to push back on our adversaries? I often wonder how we approach that sort of from the 30,000 foot perspective, because unlike a Russia, a China, or a North Korea, we're not trying to harm the middle class of those countries. We're not trying to take down a water system or a food supply somewhere in rural China. That's not what we as the U.S. want to do. It seems to be what they want to do to us. So we have very different philosophies, very different values in terms of what we want to do or don't want to do. So with all of that said, what is our sort of overarching approach to offensive cyber operations? And do you think we're doing a good job at it right now?
Yeah, Ben, great question. It's where I think we should be most acutely aware. We have a lot more battle space to defend in the cyber realm than anyone else. Certainly here in the United States, we're the most advanced. It ironically means we're the most vulnerable in a lot of ways. The other aspect I would say on this is that the United States in a classified setting has been very, very good at this. And so I will say from an unclassified perspective, we can see the results of this from times when I was on the National Security Council. You look at what happened with Iran's nuclear program through the Stuxnet. Very articulated, very acute, highly effective, went after Siemens routers, but didn't spread to the rest of the world. But it destroyed Iran's capability. That's an offensive operation. Whoever did it was very attuned to how they could get a maximum return with minimal collateral damage. My concern here is that our best offense right now is the greater speed in which we innovate and evolve compared to our adversary. Because as you know, our primary responsibility in cybersecurity has to be in the cyber defense of our country, and that takes a ton of resource. For very targeted operations, we have the ability to do this well. I think Americans should feel confident in that, along with our allies. But the rate of evolution for what is happening in this tech space, we have got to be at the leading edge of this. and recognize that that is by far our best offensive weapon. And that comes with a great partnership with our tech innovators, everybody from Silicon Valley in the West to Tel Aviv in the East. And it's one of the reasons we got into this year's National Defense Authorization Act, a bill that I pushed, that Defense Innovation Unit out in Silicon Valley does greater partnership with our key allies here to start bringing some of that commercial off the shelf, real world technology in a way that DARPA did, 40 years ago when people were okay with working with the Department of Defense. Now a lot of tech entrepreneurs won't even touch defense. And that's a real danger zone for us domestically that we can't even bring in other Americans to help us defend our way of life here.
Congressman Zach Nunn, thank you so much for joining us here in the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Congressman.
Hey, Ben Guy, it's a real privilege. Thanks very much for what you do. I look forward to having this conversation again. We can talk a little bit about autonomous aircraft and submarines and the future of warfare. But I think right now we got to recognize there's a lot of good people on both sides of the aisle here in Washington trying to do right by our national security. We can't let it become a secondary conversation topic.
It's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home or in some corner of the world that we think is affecting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all are listening to this episode. Guy, what do you have for us for your Threat of the Week?
My threat of the week, Ben, centers on weapons sharing between Russia and Iran and the threat that it is increasing without the U.S. and U.S. allies doing much about it. Secretary of State Blinken announced in recent days that Washington has evidence that Iran is now supplying short-range ballistic missiles to Russia for its war in Ukraine, and that the Biden administration is taking measures to punish those involved. But how? Through sanctions, of course, but the extent to which those sanctions will really bite or be effective without UN Security Council backing remains to be seen. Remember, Russia and China both have Security Council veto power. My threat of the week is that this tissue of connectivity between Iran and Russia is growing in the military realm.
That's a good one. Guy, my threat of the week is a huge gap in America's cybersecurity workforce. There is a comprehensive new report on this subject out this week from ISC2. Listeners may remember that on last week's show, we talked to John France, the Chief Information Security Officer at ISC2, live from the floor of the Billington Cybersecurity Conference. We talked about this issue briefly with him, but there's a lot of new information in this study, and a lot of it is pretty troubling. Last year, the report says there were about 5.5 million people working in global cybersecurity. The needed workforce was estimated to be about 9.5 million. This year, the gap's even bigger. The size of the workforce stayed the same, but the workforce that we need to counter all of these growing cyber threats in the world of cybersecurity is 10.2 million. That's a gap of 4.8 million people. In other words, we need almost twice as many people as we have today working on cybersecurity to match the level of threat that we are seeing. And it's not just that there's a skills gap, though that could be part of it. There are also just fewer job postings, fewer openings. Companies are downsizing. This sentence from the report, I think, kind of sums it up. Quote, at a time when organizations can least afford the cost, disruption, and reputational damage of a cybersecurity incident, the profession is under its greatest pressure to maintain safety and security with fewer resources, unquote. This is a problem because, as we have detailed on this show extensively, cybersecurity professionals right now, both in private industry and government, are the front lines of defense against hackers, cyber attacks from Russia, Iran, ransomware groups, and a whole bunch of other malicious actors out there. As technology advances, more and more of our data is out there on the web, and the more vulnerable it is, the more people we need working to protect it. But right now, for a host of reasons, a lot of them apparently financial, the workforce isn't matching the problem. And that's why it's my threat of the week right now.
Interesting, Ben. Also a forward-looking take on a very sobering problem for the U.S. government.
Yeah, and one that needs to get addressed quickly. That's for sure. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Guy, for joining me. And thank you all for listening. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button. A huge thanks to Congressman Zach Nunn for joining us here on the show this week. So share with all of your friends, and we will be back next week here on the Threat Status Podcast.